According to a recent survey conducted by the Pew Research Center, it discovered that 42% of working women in the United States claim that they've experienced some type of gender discrimination in the workplace. Making progress on gender equality has certainly been a marginal effort. Having equal representation in life can also be a struggle, depending on your background, experience, and upbringing. Gender discrimination and relations still remains an issue which deserves our undivided attention. David Smith is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, Carey Business School, a gender work and family researcher. He's an author and a speaker. Through his research and experience leading diverse organizations, he's established his value to organizations looking to improve their gender relations. Dr. Smith is known for facilitating tough conversations surrounding the concept of gender relations and bringing that skill to his consulting, teaching, writing, and speaking. And Dr. Smith joined me this week to have an in-depth discussion on how gender relations have evolved in today's society. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. If you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm super excited to dive into your work on gender relations this morning. Great to see you, and happy Friday!
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Now, Professor, I know you work with organizations to work on their gender relations, and your diverse research focuses on that very topic. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about all the great work that you do.
Yeah, and my research is really kind of comes out of a lot of my work experience, and I spent 30 years on active duty in the military as a Navy pilot. And again, I think work experience is always a nice place to kind of ground your research and the lived experience that we have, and certainly I saw lots of that in my time in the military. And I think that, one of those we're just really seeing how, from a gender perspective, and then saw a lot of the gender integration process happen across my career in the U.S. military, and seeing how it was implemented was really interesting in the terms of, I think the military tends to come at this from a very kind of a process perspective and setting boundaries and giving very direct orders around how to do things. But, one of the things that was never really discussed were about how it was going to affect relationships and the culture within teams and within smaller groups and organizations. And I think that was one of the things that always kind of was front and center in my mind, and thinking about how it influenced my research. And certainly for myself, I think, my wife was also active duty military, and our experience, and as a dual career couple in this case, was very challenging in terms of all the moving we had to do and trying to be co-located. And again, the military, like a lot of organizations back in the 80s and 90s and even into today, just weren't weren't really structured to handle diverse families, and dual career families back then were kind of diverse, although today they are the norm out there. So a lot of that shaped a lot of the questions and how I've approached the research that I do.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into gender relations in today's society. And how do you think it's really evolved when we talk about the societal conversation surrounding gender relations? How do you think it's evolved over time?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in a lot of ways we've moved beyond a lot of the what I would think of more of kind of structural, overt discrimination that was legalized in many ways in workplaces very broadly about who could do what and how we paid people and how we valued people differently in that way. And so a lot of employment processes across the board we're not fair, and those have, for the most part, those have legally, that's all changed. There are still some countries out there that are still following along, but certainly in North America and Canada and the U.S. and Europe, we find that that's all changed. So we've moved beyond the overt, and now we're dealing with things that are kind of happening underneath all of that. And so it's much more insidious, and it's more about attitudes and bias that we are focusing on today that still influence these employment processes and still influence decision making that create some of these, what I would call systemic inequities. So we have an everyday practice. It might be around hiring or recruiting, right? That tends to bias in one direction or another. And it does change the talent pool that we're looking at, the talent pool that we're selecting from, and the people that we're selecting is as just one example of that. And so it's a little more challenging to put your finger on things that you can't actually see other than the outcome itself. But the process, sometimes it's not quite as easy to do that. And so I think that's what's taking most of our time today is going through and looking at the everyday practices to begin to understand how they're creating some of these systemic inequities, like a lack of representation in many of our organizations.
Yeah, Professor, you bring up a lack of representation, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today was because, March is also National Disability Awareness Month, and as you know, Professor, I was born with cerebral palsy, and I also have a background in inclusive employment. So tell me about the importance of infusing folks with disabilities into the workforce, and the importance, you think, observing months like this are in our general conversation of progress.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. And as a reminder, what we should be focusing on. And it's really interesting that, again, the way the workplace is structured is for particular groups of people, and certainly able-bodied people is one of those ways that it tends to be structured. And people who are able-bodied, unless they are thinking about it and have experienced it or have developed the awareness and the understanding of how this affects people with all sorts of great skills and talents that would be great additions to our organization, how it really precludes them and very specifically excludes them in some ways out there. And we're missing out because of that in our organizations today. And so in the same way that it works for gender, it's a little bit different, but even there are still structural processes that we have in the organization that exclude, again, people with the skills and the talent that we need in our organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Professor, I'm curious to get your definition of how you define courageous leadership in organizations today. How do you define that term?
Yeah, for me, it really comes down to thinking about how do we approach risk and thinking about failure. And I think so in so many ways, people, especially today, there's a fear of failure in a lot of organizations. So it keeps you from taking risks that we should be taking, and the opportunity to improve our organizations and our society more broadly out there, without taking some of those, again, very calculated risks. We're not talking about things that are we're just throwing caution to the wind, but these are opportunities. And if we don't take a risk and we don't learn to, we're not going to get it exactly right every time, but we're going to learn. And that's how, again, innovation works. We fear often. I mean, we fail often, and we overcome that fear in terms of how do we move forward in our organ. And that's what advances science. That's what advances our society. That's what makes it a better place to work. And again, we've got to overcome some of that fear, and that, hey, leadership is not about taking the safe route. Leadership is not about staying comfortable. It's going to require you to be uncomfortable. If you're not a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe a lot uncomfortable today as a leader, then I would say you're not doing your job properly. You're not answering the mail, doing what you're supposed to be doing, and answering to all your stakeholders in your organization.
Yeah, and Professor, I know that you're also trained in social psychology, and you focus your research on gender work and families, including allyship and
Mm-hmm.
cross-gender mentor relationships. So tell me about that and gender bias as well. So tell me about that part of your research and why that's also important to you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's, as I think with anybody, the arc of your research it's a journey to some extent, and as I told you, at the beginning, a lot of that has been influenced by my own experiences, and I think as we see things, it raises questions, right, about why is that, or why does it work that way, and how could it be better? How can we better understand that? And again, I use that to my advantage in terms of how we approach a lot of the research that we do, and so. I think looking at some of those things as we see opportunities to explore them is part of it. And again, a lot of the work that I've done has focused there. One of the places right now, for example, done working around looking at gender bias and performance evaluations. And it was really interesting as we did that research, some really interesting findings that came out of it. But one of the things also was just a list of other questions, things of opportunities we saw there. And one of the things that was really important to us was around intersectionality and looking at, again, not just from a gender lens, but how do we disaggregate that data a little bit further and look at it from other perspectives as well, and how intersecting identities really may change the results of what we had there. And so we are looking at that now from a race gender perspective, and really coming up with some very different results. And so that's exciting for us as well. Same thing goes for ideas about how do we show up as allies in the workplace. And again, I think intersectionality is an important part of that, and thinking about how we can't make too many assumptions about just because somebody identifies as being a man or as a woman or non-binary, what that must mean, right? That there are other intersecting identities there that shape our lived experience, and again, the impact that has on us. And so continuing to kind of remain intellectually humble and open to, again, how people may have very different experiences in the workplace that are very different from my own, I think helps all of us to advance research, but also to advance, how we're doing things in the workplace as leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And Professor, tell me your thoughts on how you think the conversation around gender relations is contributing to the conversation around education today in America, because it seems to be a changing landscape. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I would say it's maybe even a minefield today politically. Things are quite charged around our country right now, and on not just gender, but other aspects as well around diversity, and being able to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways that are productive. And so I do think that it is, unfortunately, politically, that has been latched onto as a divisive area. But I think more broadly, as you think about education, lots of things, the shifting change of the number of women, for example, from a gender perspective, number of women attending, undergraduate institutions has been majority women for a long time now, have earned the majority of those bachelor degrees, and now even graduate degrees and even professional degrees now. And so we're seeing that, we're balancing it in the schoolhouses, the advanced education, from a gender perspective really well. What hasn't caught up quite as fast, and there may be a little bit of a lag and delay in this, is really thinking about the faculty and the people who are doing the teaching. And so we are still working hard, I think, in a lot of educational institutions like my own, to really look at our employment processes and make sure that we are hiring fairly and equitably as we think about across, again, the broad spectrum of diversity, not just around gender, but more broadly around that. and thinking about who's doing the teaching in the classroom, because that matters too. And it matters in inspiring the next generation of scientists, of leaders in our world, of business managers, because they're looking at their faculty, who are the ones, they look up to, and they need to see themselves somewhere in there too. And so we need to make sure that we're representative just as much as our student body is. And so, yeah, a lot of shifts going on in education, and I think there's a lot of great open conversations that we're able to have about this now.
Representation certainly matters, absolutely. And Professor, I'm curious to ask you about how you think workplace diversification and gender relations are interconnected.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There is a lot of this, and there's actually theory and research that goes with this too. That to really create a more equitable workplace, a place where people feel like, again, we don't just have diversity as we think about representation within the room or within the organization, but people actually feel like they're included and they're valued and they belong, right? And so the more research today going into things like belongingness and how that, from an engagement perspective in an organization, matters. And it matters in terms of the culture, because it begins to shift the culture. And so this is where diversity begins to interconnect there with the relations in the workplace. We have diverse perspectives as we begin to help shift the culture so people belong. I begin maybe to interact with people who are different from me, that open my eyes. I get to, if I have an openness to that experience and to be able to learn from them, they share their experiences, they feel safe, right? We need to have that psychological safety within our workplace, that people can show up authentically. If you're a parent, whether you're, again, no matter your gender, whatever, if you're a parent, that you can show up and talk about your family and the responsibilities that you have and the things that you're working on, right? And so we can be our whole selves when we show up in the workplace. And that goes for a lot of other hidden, again, invisible identities that people have the opportunity in many ways to choose, hopefully, whether or not they're going to divulge those, and around sexuality or trans, but whether you're even a veteran, right? The veteran status is another one that's a very stigmatizing sometimes in different organizations. And so the more people feel comfortable and that they can develop the trust they have with other people there, and they can open and be themselves, again, the better the relations are, the better the performance of the team is. And of course, that translates into whatever your mission or business outcomes are in your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, Professor, I have a two-part question for you, and you can take this any direction that you want. I'm curious to ask you, when it comes to gender relations, what do you think it's going to take to really establish a table of inclusion where everyone's perspective and opinions on gender are going to be valued? And as an educator, the second part of the question is, as an educator, do you think when you teach your students, is there any consistent theme you hope that they take away from conversations that they have in class with you or one-on-one individually?
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me try to tackle that first one there about what it's going to take to get there. And I guess the optimism I have around this, and I am an optimist when it comes to this, that I see the attitudes changing, and we've certainly seen that in the research as well. And so shifting attitudes, right, tend to eventually bleed over into behavioral change, right, and which leads to action. And that, I think, is the name of the game, is we're, again, increasing our ability to have and value diverse organizations and leverage that as a competitive advantage. It's a very strategic advantage to have that in organizations today. We tend to focus so much on technology or the product or this very specific service, the thing that we're selling, so to speak, in our organizations, but people are our greatest resource. They always have been. I don't know that AI is going to change that anytime soon, I hope. But for the foreseeable future, again, people are going to be that competitive advantage we have. And so I think, again, as we continue to open have these conversations with each other and and really get leaders who are going to structure workplaces in a way that shows that they value people, right? And they value where they come from, they value their experience, they value the difference that they bring. That we can all, because our society is not getting any less diverse, it's getting more diverse over time. And certainly our organizations reflect that and need to reflect that. And businesses that are taking that on as part of their strategy are the ones who are going to be most successful out there. So that's the optimist in me when it comes to that. The other question I think is another great one. I love that question about, kind of the common theme. What do I, across my courses, across the work that I do, that I want my students to take away? And really, I think one of the things that I always emphasize is being a great consumer of information. Because one of the things we all do, and whether you're in academe, education, you're out in the business world, is we're bombarded with all sorts of information. And some of it's more valuable than others, but learning to be a good consumer of information, of being discerning, of looking at the data, looking at the evidence, looking at the argument, that it's written by somebody with a point of view. From their own experience. It's written from a research perspective, maybe, or a disciplinary perspective, but it always has a point of view or a perspective, and they have an intent with what they are doing with that data, with that argument, with that evidence. And if we're being more transparent about it, and people are being, very, open about who they are and what their bias or perspective is on things, I think that's helpful, but that's not always the case today. We don't always get that. And so I think learning to be good critical consumers of information in today's day and age, I just don't think you can replace that, especially in a leadership role.
Yeah, absolutely. And Professor, my final question for you this morning has to do with your own individual and personal legacy and how you want that to be defined.
I think this is always I think from a humility perspective, this is always a hard question. I don't know that we often think about ourselves in terms of a legacy or that, but I do feel like that everything that I do is something where I'm trying to make a difference, make my organization better, make my team better, my family, my society better. And leave it in a better place than it was when I came into it. And being, I think good, in the same way we can be good consumers of evidence, we can be good citizens in our society. We can be good citizens in our workplaces and what that looks like, and leaving that behind as helping people to be better at doing that. And I think that, that's my noble goal. As you think about my life mission, purpose is really to make a difference and helping people to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Professor, tell me if people want to get connected with you personally, or some of the books that you've written, how is the best way they can do that?
Yeah, my website with my co-author, Brad Johnson, is Workplace Allies. So Workplace Allies, all one word.com. And you can see, again, what we're up to, the latest things we've been up to, events we're doing, things we're writing about, thinking about. And yeah, you can definitely find more information about our books, Athena Rising, which focuses on how to be better mentors and thinking about it from a cross-gender perspective. And then certainly Good Guys, from engaging each other as allies in the workplace.
Fantastic. Well, Professor, I want to thank you for spending some time with me to dive into the subject of gender relations on this front, and your work in the space, and time on my behalf is most appreciated. And I want to thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you including me, and have a happy Friday.